Welcome back. I'm Peter St. Onge. This is a weekly roundup of my daily videos on the economy and freedom, where I cut through the BS and lay out what the gaslighting clowns pulled out of their hats this week and what is coming next. The federal deficit exploded last month despite tariff revenue flooding in as Congress's freight train speeds us straight off the cliff. First, the good news, tariff revenue is now coming in at $250 billion annualized, which in theory creates room for income tax cuts that are far more helpful than tariffs. But then the very bad news, last month the federal government spent $630 billion, which is $7.5 trillion annualized. That's nearly 10% up in a year, and notably the economy did not grow 10% last year, so the American people lost ground. This put the federal government in deficit for an annualized $3.5 trillion. Moreover, that deficit is up 20% last year. We definitely didn't grow 20% last year. In fact, it was the first July outside of the COVID spending orgy in 2020. Now, this is all pretty weird considering small government Republicans have total control of Washington plus Doge's big balls. So what's driving it? In raw numbers, year-to-date spending is up $397 billion over last year. About a fifth of that is added interest on the national debt, which is now the second biggest category after Social Security, as in we are borrowing the interest payments. Of the remaining $319, fully 92% was mandatory programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Outside these, it was just a tiny little $16 billion spending bump, about 0.5%. Beta, $43 billion more on military and border, and an actual cut of $17 billion in non-defense discretionary, meaning everything from U.S. aid to CDC to the Department of Education. So while media loves pinning worst deficit ever on Trump, roughly 96% of the spending came either from legacy debt or from social programs Congress puts on autopilot so they don't have to actually vote for 96% of spending increases. So what's next? While Congress could have cut more, the core problem is the social programs on autopilot. Republicans did throw a couple cuts into Big Beautiful on Medicaid for able-bodied and student loans, but current estimates say we've got somewhere between $100 and $200 trillion in hidden debt on those social programs, so-called unfunded liabilities, on top of the annual $250 billion spending boosts. That would take national debt close to $250 quadrillion, which is just shy of a gazillion. For perspective, $250 trillion of debt is literally more than the entire net worth of the American people. So yes, the federal government literally owes everything we own. The problem, of course, is cutting Social Security and Medicare is how you lose elections. Grandma eating cat food headlines write themselves, meaning the only way to fix it is ram through a balanced budget amendment that sets off a gladiator battle where you can't invade Afghanistan, rebuild Ukraine, or gender swap illegals because Social Security needs the money. Unfortunately, there is no appetite in Washington for a balanced budget that clips their own wings, meaning the most likely is we autopilot straight off the cliff, at which point investors stop buying treasuries, interest rates soars, and the Fed parachutes in to replace the buyers, bringing us to the end game of a central bank literally printing the annual budget, which could go Japan, 30 years of recession, or it could go Argentina, where anybody who doesn't have gold or Bitcoin is eating the cat food. Having given up for now on firing Jerome Powell, Donald Trump is going after another Federal Reserve board member for mortgage fraud. Now, this matters because the Fed is about to have 3 members Trump appointed, 3 members Biden appointed, and the Obama-appointed Jerome Powell as the swing vote on the all-important Board of Governors who decide interest rates, jobs, and inflation. That means if Trump can get just one of the Biden people out, he will have a majority to push through the huge rate cuts he wants to turbo boost a Trump boom. So the background here is the Fed is run by 12 members. 7 are so-called governors nominated by presidents to 14-year terms, 1 every 2 years. The other 5 rotate from regional feds who are chosen by bankers, but the 5 rotators have to be approved by the 7, meaning ultimate power is in those 7. In other words, think of it as a monetary Supreme Court, but instead of 9 justices, there's 7. And Trump is looking at just 3, which is a losing hand. Now, normally a president just waits out the clock, appoints his new people, and captures the board. In fact, that's what Ronald Reagan did. In fact, Reagan faced an almost identical situation. He inherited Carter's double-digit inflation and a Jimmy Carter-appointed Fed that was fighting it with 20% interest rates even after inflation came down. That turned Reagan's first 2 years into a brutal series of recessions fighting yesterday's inflation. But thanks to the calendar, Reagan was able to appoint 6 board members. So he just waited out the clock, swapped members one by one, including Mr. Irrational Exuberance, Alan Greenspan, and presto, we got the 1980s boom, going all the way to the year 2000. Now for Trump, it's a very different story because the next seat doesn't open until 2028, meaning the only way Trump can get his Reagan revolution is fire a couple. Now, presidents have clear authority to fire Fed members for so-called cause, which includes neglect of duty, corruption or abuse of power, and illegal activities. And that brings us to Governor Cook, who appears to have fraudulently obtained 2 mortgages within 2 weeks, attesting each would be her primary residence. Now, people do this because interest rates and terms are better on primary residences, but it is textbook mortgage fraud. Cook, of course, denies wrongdoing, but mortgage applications don't lie, so she may be looking for a new job. So even if Trump gets rid of Cook or Cook and Jerome Powell, it'll still take time to translate into big rate cuts, since all those rotating members have to be rolled out one by one. Of course, there's a much faster way to get the low interest rates Trump wants: lower inflation. From housing and energy to manufacturing, health, and education, crony regulations add something like 20% to prices. For perspective, even the Fed pegs tariffs at just 0.7%. Now, Trump's doing what he can. He got rid of cafe rules that drive up car prices. He's trying to deregulate housing and health, and of course, drill baby drill. But big deregulations need Congress, who cashes too many donor checks to gut the regulatory state those checks bought. Till that changes, Trump is stuck rearranging deck chairs on the Fed. A word from our sponsor. If you own gold, and many of you do, you already understand how it protects your wealth from the insanity coming out of Washington. The inflation, the recessions, the wars. But with monetary metals, there's a way to actually earn a yield of up to 4% on your gold paid in more ounces of gold. You retain ownership of real, allocated physical gold with no storage costs while your ounces grow every month outside the banking system. If you're serious about protecting your future and building your legacy, head to monetarymetals.com/Peter to get started. Now back to our show. The German economy is in free fall thanks to suicidal environmental, tax, and regulatory burdens, while government spending soars on mass migrants, in case you wonder where we'd be if Kamala won. Now, Germany matters because it's nearly a third of industrial production in the EU, with a lot of the rest being German subcontractors in places like Poland or Belgium. In other words, if Germany falls, Europe takes a big step towards what the FT calls, quote, an open-air museum for Chinese and American tourists. Jamaica with nicer buildings, but worse beaches. The numbers come from the German Central Bank, who reports industrial production is down 21% since pre-pandemic. Meanwhile, Germany's employment agency reports in the last year alone, Germany lost 446,000 productive jobs. In U.S. terms, that would be nearly 2 million jobs lost. More concerningly, they replaced nearly half of those with 191,000 government workers, so nurses, teachers for migrants, social workers, bureaucrats who run it all. In other words, Germany is going Soviet, deindustrializing at light speed, while increasing the burden on surviving producers who have to pay the salaries of another 191,000 bureaucrats. What's driving it, of course, is Germany's left-wing government wiped out cheap energy with pixie farts and windmills, while saddling the entire economy with hundreds of thousands of new regulations. One recent IFO study estimated 20% of employee time for German white collars is spent on regulations. That's 2 to 4 times what it is in the U.S. To give a flavor, they just put out guidance that companies celebrating employee birthdays have to obtain consent in writing to avoid discrimination fines. Oddly enough, Germany's current leader is actually from the right-wing CDU, which should be pro-economy, but he's heading a coalition of both major parties, left and right, which they did to shut out the right populist AfD. So it's basically Mitt Romney and Kamala ruling as a team to shut out Donald Trump. Thanks to this ground clown car, Germany now has the 5th highest energy prices in the world at over 40 cents per kilowatt hour. That's up nearly 50% since 2021, and it's 3 times what energy costs in growing American manufacturing states like Tennessee, Kentucky, or North Carolina. So that matters in car production or steel, which are the mainstays of German industry. Now, energy and red tape now combine for a giant sucking sound that Donald Trump is supercharging with tariffs that force German companies to relocate at least some of their production to the U.S., at which point the energy and red tape will encourage even more offshoring to America. So come for the tariffs, stay for drill, baby, drill. Despite Europe's Soviet-level censorship complex, German voters are believing their eyes as their jobs evaporate and their cities spawn migrant no-go zones. A major poll found the right populist AfD is now the biggest party in Germany. Other polls put it neck and neck, to which Germany's corrupt establishment responded by threatening to ban the party for racism, while pushing a new Europe-wide disinformation regime that would force social media to censor speech and narc the thought criminals. The Trump administration is pretty much the only one fighting European censorship, with zero thanks for most European voters, since EU censorship impacts Americans who also post on social media. So as next, the European Union was created as a competitor to the US. 30 years ago, maybe that looked like a possibility, but the EU went woke, and now it's going broke, with Donald Trump champing at the bit to cart off Europe's crown jewels to America. Last week, Social Security turned 90. Will it survive another decade? Recently, Elon Musk called Social Security the, quote, biggest Ponzi scheme of all time. Donald Trump asserts the program is just fine so long as Democrats do not get their grubby little paws on it. Meanwhile, the chief actuary of Social Security says it will be bankrupt in just 7 years. So which is it, 7 years of Ponzi or 90 years so long as Republicans are in charge? The key here is Social Security bankruptcy does not mean what most people think. Does not mean the checks end and grandma eats the cat food. It simply means the so-called Social Security trust fund is exhausted and the program starts losing money every year. So the trust fund is the stockpile of U.S. Treasuries built up over the past 90 years while people were paying into Social Security, but not yet retired. That's the Ponzi part of it. The trust fund peaked in 2020 at nearly $3 trillion. And since then, it's been losing about $100 billion a year. But it's now expected to accelerate and run out in just 7 more years. That would mean nearly $3 trillion lost in just 12 years under Democrats and Republicans. Of course, the kicker is the trust fund is already gone because there's nothing in there but IOUs, government debt. As in, every dollar of surplus in Social Security was already spent by Congress and replaced with an IOU. And when those IOUs run out, when Social Security is bankrupt, it simply recognizes reality. The money is long gone. What happens then? In theory, they could cut benefits. A 20% cut would stabilize the program. Or they could hike taxes. Democrats have long argued to subject all income to 15% Social Security and Medicare taxes. They could even raise the retirement age again, which Reagan did in the 1980s, taking it from 65 to 67. Of course, in reality, they will do none of these things. Instead, they will take the path of least resistance and just let Social Security losses roll as fresh new deficit on top of the 1.6 trillion plus deficits we are currently running. And these will be large. The Congressional Budget Office estimates $6.3 trillion in Social Security deficits in the first 10 years after bankruptcy, and then almost doubling every decade after that. Now, these losses go on top of regular deficits, which CBO projects at roughly $2 trillion in that first decade every single year. That all takes us to a cool $2.5 trillion in deficits as far as the eye can see, until the great paper money Ragnarok, when gold and Bitcoin shall inherit the earth. So what's next? It shouldn't be this way. Countries like Chile or Singapore run Social Security like 401ks, so allowing people to invest it and keeping it out of the grubby paws of both parties. In fact, if we ran Social Security like a 401k since 401k started, returns would roughly quadruple, and we'd have perhaps $18 trillion in surplus, half the national debt. In fact, if we ran Social Security like 401ks since the beginning back in the 30s, it would have something between 50 and 100 trillion, which would be almost $1 million per American household. Turning Social Security into a 401k style program that's out of Congress's reach, so-called privatization, is the only way to save it. But given that won't happen, it will instead go bankrupt, turn into tens of trillions of debt, one more albatross forcing the Fed into permanent inflation. Grandma will not eat the cat food, but the dollar will. A word from our sponsor. One of the best ways to secure your Bitcoin is with a hardware wallet, a physical device that lets you keep your coins offline without internet connection. One of the most trusted names in hardware wallets is CoinKite, maker of the famous block clock. CoinKite devices are made in Canada and they're run by passionate Bitcoiners who've been at this since 2012, back when Bitcoiners were trading in person at swap meets. You can pick up hardware wallets and plenty of other goodies at coinkite.com/ProfSaintAnge. That's CoinKite.com/ProfSaintAnge. Okay, back to our show. Donald Trump is making a play for the 98% of Americans who are not professional criminals. Democrats, of course, are taking the bait, calling his pledge to reduce murder in Washington, D.C., quote, fascist. Just a week in, the results have been pretty stunning. According to the D.C. Police Union, violent crime and car theft are down 21%, robbery is down 46%, carjacking, the crime that set it off after big balls got jacked, is down 83%. So how did crime get so bad, and how can Trump fix it? First mystery is voters hate violent crime, obviously, yet American cities have crime rates rivaling Haiti, suggesting there is some slippage between what voters want and what politicians deliver. A recent YouGov poll found Americans think we're not tough enough on crime by a 4-1 margin. Now, this seems like a freebie for any enterprising politician. El Salvador's base President Bukele hit 90% approval after he cut murder rates 96%. El Salvador is now safer than Vermont. So it's possible, and it's popular. Why doesn't it happen? Two reasons: progressive laws that coddle criminals and progressive budgets that raid police and prisons and hand the money to activists. So the laws happened in the 1960s when the Progressive Warren Court tied police and judges' hands by restricting voluntary confessions, tossing good faith evidence and warrants, and funding hundreds of thousands of public defenders. He slashed the odds of doing time, so Nobel economist Gary Becker estimated that by the late 60s, the expected sentence for committing a murder was just 5 years. For robbery, it was 3 months. For car theft or burglary, it was less than 2 weeks. Now, courts responded by plea bargaining over 90% of crimes with an average 80% discount off the sentence. Toss in aggressive prosecution of police, and this made it very hard to catch, prosecute, and imprison criminals. And when they are imprisoned, they get out fast. Meanwhile, budgets were raided by progressives, most notoriously closing the asylums that dumped 500,000 insane people onto the streets, giving us an instant nationwide homeless crisis that, of course, was blamed on capitalism. During COVID, they moved on to emptying the prisons while defunding police budgets. The result is career criminals with zero fear, while police resources are starved. To give a sense, the Congressional Research Service estimates up to 400,000 rape kits sit untested, literally expiring while the rapists run free. So how can Trump fix it? The quickest way is flood the zone with resources. That's what El Salvador did. Take the trillions we spend invading Afghanistan's or propping up Ukraine's and use it to protect actual Americans. The longer game is reverse those 1960s decisions. So allow good faith warrants and exclusionary rules, voluntary confessions, restrict plea bargains, and defund the public defender industrial complex that's currently protecting criminals and illegals. And if the court won't play ball, the nuclear option, suspend habeas corpus, meaning mass sweeps and no trials like Lincoln and FDR did, and Bush II tried in Guantanamo. Now, this probably won't happen, but Trump's style is bring it up. So what's next? Trump won the White House by turning the deep blue Rust Belt red. If he goes all in on law and order, cities like New York, Philly, and even Chicago could go purple enough to flip the state, yes, even California. Progressives will fight every inch for criminals like they fight for illegals, but Trump's got the opportunity of a lifetime. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and go to petersaintange.com for daily videos and in-depth articles with charts and all the gory details. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.